This week's surveys, and I'm going to be talking about two things. One is the process of doing a survey, its position as a major research design, and the process you go through, and talk about some of the different kinds of surveys. Yes, thanks very much. Some of the different kinds of surveys that are done. I think I'll spend a bit of time talking about online surveys and things like that. And then I'm going to be talking about sampling issues, and most surveys are done based on some kind of sampling approach. And sampling and getting a good sample, and particularly, think back to what I talked about last week, the issue of generalizability. Sampling is there to try to ensure that the samples you take in a survey are as generalizable as possible. So generalizability is the big issue that sampling tries to address, and I'll talk about some of those things. And I've got an exercise which I'll give you halfway through, which is looking at some of the some questions really about sampling and some ideas about how you might draw samples of the best possible kind in different kinds of research circumstances. So, okay, first of all, then talking about surveys in a general sense as a research design. And here are the major characteristics. I'll talk about the same thing when I come to case studies and to experiments in subsequent sessions. But this week, just this to start with on surveys. Surveys collect a small amount of data, relatively small that is. I mean, surveys can be quite large. I mean, I once filled in a questionnaire that was over 100 pages long. I think I've got a £20 token for doing it, not exactly much for the amount of work involved. But so it can be, physically a large amount, but comparatively small amount. And in fact, a lot of surveys based on questionnaires are just 1 or 2 pages long, so that's a not unusual standard. So the key point is a relatively small set of data, first of all. But it comes in a standardized form. And of course, as I already said, the most common version of that is the questionnaire. Isn't always. You can do surveys without questionnaires. You can do surveys based on interviews, for example, or surveys based on observation as a way of collecting the data. So there are different ways of collecting data, but I have to say that by and far the most common kind of survey is one based on a questionnaire. So that's the instrument that's used. But the important point is whether it's a questionnaire or observation or it's interview, whatever, it's a standardized form. And what that means is that every person that you approach in your sample gets the same thing, the same set of questions. There may be some variation. They may not all be able to answer the same question. You might have some questions that talk about, the children in their family, and some respondents may not have a family or may not have children to talk about. So that won't be relevant to them. But nevertheless, they have to go through the same standard set of questions that have, asked them if they have a family, and if not, they go on to the next one, and so on. So that the standardized form in which you start is the same for everybody. So that's another key point of the survey is the standardized form. And then a relatively large number of people. Again, it's relative. It's relative to things like a qualitative case study, for example, where you might simply take in a handful of people, or a dozen or so, 20 people, that kind of number. In a survey, you're normally dealing with the numbers in the hundreds, if not better, thousands of people. So these are much, much bigger numbers of individuals who come into the sample than you would get in, say, a qualitative work. Or for that matter, an experiment. An experiment's often done on just, 20 people, 25 people, that sort of thing. So much bigger numbers. So those are the key points. Small amount of data relatively, a standardized instrument being used, the questionnaire most commonly, and on a large sample, a large number of people. And this other key point here, which is why I'm going to talk about sampling in the second half, is that it's key to the survey that the sample is representative. And of course, because of that, you can generalize to the population. And it's representative from a known population. So you have both those issues, how to make it representative and how to know the population, how to get a record, a listing, if you like, or some definition of what the population is from which you're drawing your sample. I'll say this later on, but of course not every survey takes a sample. You don't have to sample. Sampling is for convenience, really, because the population is so large usually. So if you're looking at doing a survey of the Kirklees, this region, with about 250,000 people, then almost certainly you would sample. But you don't have to. The most common, most well-known example that isn't sampling, of course, is the census, which takes every single person in the country, or tries to anyway. It doesn't always succeed. But if you're talking much smaller populations, so the known population might be relatively small. For example, if you want to do a survey of this class, then you might simply take every single person. You wouldn't have to sample. It might not be necessary. In fact, the numbers are that small, you wouldn't actually bother about sampling. You just simply survey everybody. So your sample can be 100% in that kind of case. Okay. Surveys, I'm sure as you recognise, are very common. I mean, almost all of us have done surveys. That is, we've filled in questionnaires, we've answered things and so on. You know, commercial companies are forever putting out questionnaires about their products and things like that. These days, I mean, it's almost impossible to buy something online, for example, without getting an email coming a few days later saying, please will you fill in this little short questionnaire about your purchasing experience and so on. So it's been taken up in all sorts of areas. But in the more serious social scientific research area, surveys are also very common as well. As I said here, most calls for research, most invitations to bid for money often call for surveys, at least as part of the work they're doing. So it's a you know, a very, very common technique, if not the most common technique being used. An interesting development here, by the way, is the mixed methods approach. I think I've mentioned the previous week. Mixed methods mixes together typically qualitative and quantitative. And one thing you often find these days is a mixture of a survey done quantitatively based on a questionnaire where you're counting and so on, and calculating percentages, combined with some kind of qualitative work, often based on some kind of interviews of a subset. So a mixed methods approach often is a survey plus some kind of smaller number of case studies or interviews or whatever done alongside it. Here's some references, and I've given you a much longer list of references, but I thought I'd mention some of the key texts. Given surveys are so frequent, given it's quite likely you'll come across surveys, things that you have to read, have to appraise, or even at some stage yourself design and do, it's extremely likely you'll get involved at some point in your career in doing a survey, it's worth knowing that there are some key books. Probably the most popular is the De Vos book. I'm not sure if that's the most recent edition. You can see it's in its 5th edition, even in 2002. I think there's probably another one come out since then, in the last 10 years. All these books are thick volumes. The De Vos, I think, is the thickest, about 2 inches thick. It's a really heavyweight, and they all include everything. They talk about how to design the surveys, how to carry it out, how to design the questionnaire, which I'll come back to, by the way, in another session. I'll have a session just devoted to questionnaire design later on. And they also cover the sampling issues that I'll be talking about later on today. The Aldridge one is a slimmer volume from the Open University Press. Floyd Fowler is Sage's entry into this market, another heavyweight book. At the bottom I put in there really for historic reasons. I don't think these are being published anymore, but you'll find them in the library. They're there partly because they're the ones I started with when I started in this area. Moser and Corton was the key text. You can see from the date, 71. Even the publisher no longer exists. Gower has been taken over years ago. It was republished several times, but it's often cited as a classic text in the area. So, and again, it'll be in the library and it's still being used, along with Hoynvid and Jowl that came out slightly later. So the ones at the top are the more frequent ones. And of course, there are other books on the list I've given you. Almost every publisher has a book on survey work of some kind. And there are other books on aspects of survey work, particularly focusing on questionnaire design, for example, or on sampling issues and things of that kind. So that's why I've given you a longer list as well to work with. Okay. Right, how do you mount a survey? How do you actually carry out a survey? I don't know why it's called mounting. Sounds like a horse, doesn't it? Mounting a survey. But you mount a survey, you carry out a survey, you do a survey, whatever particular verb you're using here. Well, first of all, there are the stages. And a bit like I talked about last week, this is the normative kind of approach. This is how it should be done. And actually, it makes sense most of the time, if you're carrying out a survey, to go through this order. In particular, working out the questionnaire design before you start sending it out. You must do all that first. I mean, think of it logically. There's no point in sending out a very badly done questionnaire design. You're going to spend quite a lot of money and time sending it out, so make sure it's good. So doing that up front is important. So you start, of course, with your initial design. And I think an important point here to bear in mind, if you are doing it yourself, a mistake that people often make when doing surveys and designing questionnaires is they start thinking of questions to write on the questionnaire. And that's not a good idea. You need to do that at some stage, but right at the beginning, think about the research questions you want answered. And then later on, think about how you're going to find out the answers by asking the questions on the questionnaire. So start with what you need to find out. Start with your research questions, your more general ideas, your ideas based in the social theory you're looking at and so on. And then later on, think about the actual way of wording questions and asking questions of people. So try to avoid getting in I'm going to ask this question kind of right at the very beginning, and think more generally about what the questionnaire is trying to achieve, what the survey is trying to achieve. Part of that is thinking about the sample itself, and obviously your research questions will be related to some kind of sample. It might be the whole population of a country, but it's more likely to be some kind of subset. It's going to look at just, I don't know, women who turn up to the hospital with a certain disease between the ages of 30 and 50, something of that kind. So that's the way you define your sample. So whatever your interest is, whatever your research questions are, that you think about your sample. And of course, with that, you have to think about how you're going to draw your sample, how you're going to take that sample from the population, how you're going to find them and so on. I'll come back to those issues a little bit later on today. Okay, so imagine you've got past that now, you've got an idea of who you're going to do it on, you know what kind of research questions you're going to ask. The next stage is to draw up the questionnaire itself, draw up the instrument. Traditionally, of course, that's a piece of paper, and in many cases it still is a piece of paper, but it can be other things. It can be done by telephone. You still start with a piece of paper and you read it out. Or it can, of course, these days be on the internet, most typically as a website, although it can be a file you send by email and so on. But most commonly is by using web pages. So you draw it up on the web. Actually, it's not a bad idea, even if you're doing it on the web, to start by drawing it out on paper to get some idea there, and then kind of enter it into the particular site you're using for your survey.
Do you think it's improved uptake doing it on email? Because people are more likely because they can just email it back rather than having to, I know it's not much of a hassle, but posting something.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on, but there are several issues here, and the answer is yes and no. You're right, it's quite easy to do, and it's certainly much easier to send it back than it is to put a postage stamp on it and post it, or to have to take it physically to some kind of return box and so on, which is another way of doing it. And it is a big issue, getting stuff back. Making sure you have a good response rate, basically, that's the issue. So it helps a bit there. On the other hand, it's equally easy to ignore it. And there is something about the psyche somehow, I think, the human psyche, that says, well, I've got a piece of paper that someone spent some time making sure it looks good and printing it out and so on and sending it to me personally with my name on it and so on, that I'm more likely to fill it in than an email I get along with thousands of other emails. If you're anyone like me, I get hundreds of emails a day almost, and I can't respond to them all, and I don't. And it's very easy, of course, to ignore things like that on email. So. And even if it's on the web, again, you normally get an email message asking you to do it on the web, so it's the same kind of issue there. So it's both yes and no, I think, in that case. There are other problems as well. I'll come back to later on with online versions of things to do with sampling. Okay, so questionnaire construction. As I say, I've got a whole session about how to do a questionnaire, how to do it on paper or online. Whole set of issues to think about there. I'm not going to dwell on those now, I'll come back to those later. The one thing, though, to think about always in doing questionnaire design is testing it out, called piloting. You have to pilot the questionnaire design. So you have to test it out, ideally, with the kind of people you're going to be using in your actual survey. Not the actual people, So don't do it on, don't send the people you're going to contact an early version, then another version, then another version, because given in mind what I said last week, that could be biasing them. It prepares them for the answers and maybe change their answers. So pick people like the people you're going to survey. So if it's a particular subgroup of the population, choose other members of that subgroup who you're not going to use in your final sample and let them have a look at it and comment on it. And of course also you can give it to your mates and your friends, your colleagues and so on to have a look at. It's always good to get other people's eyes on things, to get other people's views on what you've written. I think one of the reasons why that's so important is because we all think we know what other people are thinking like. We think we can write a questionnaire because we think we can get into their minds and see the world from their perspective and therefore write questions that address the way they see the world, the way they're thinking and so on. And I'm afraid sadly true that that's just not true. You just cannot do that. Even when you're well experienced. I mean, I do it. I've done questionnaires in the last few years, and even there I have to pilot them, to test them out. And I find things that I hadn't thought about, that I think differently from other people and so on. And therefore the questions need to be reworded or redesigned to accommodate that change to a view of other people. So piloting or testing out the design with other people, and particularly with people like your actual sample, is very, very important to do. When you're doing that, one of the things you can do is to ask them to give feedback. You can actually tell them, if you're doing the pilot, say, just don't answer the questions, write comments as well. Now, people do that anyway. People can be quite rude, actually, on answering questions if they don't think they apply or somehow or the other they don't fit into your rigid categories of things on your questionnaire. So, you can invite them to do that as well, and that's actually very helpful sometimes to get that kind of feedback as well in the piloting stage. Okay, so now you've done that, you've got an instrument you're using, or you're using something else. If you're doing interviews, for example, you have a schedule of questions you'll ask in the face-to-face interview. Or if you're doing it by observation, you might have a set of things you're going to observe and ways of doing it, so a standardised form. But most commonly, it's a set of questions you're going to ask people. And then you do the survey, you distribute your questionnaire or whatever, you do the field work. Field work, by the way, is a general term in social science used here to represent going out of the research lab, if you like, or research office, out into the world to do the research, to collect the data, to observe and to talk or whatever. That's field work. It doesn't literally mean going into a field. It means, in the metaphoric sense, going out into the town, the city, the workplace, wherever you're doing the study. Field work, I've said the most efficient stage. It depends what kind of work you're doing, actually, in surveys. If you're doing it through the web, it certainly is by the most efficient stage. Once you've done all the pre-planning and preparation work, you press a button and out it goes, and that's it. You sit back and wait for a few weeks while all the stuff comes flooding in. So that's very, very easy. If you're doing it by postal questionnaire, it's not that different either. You've sent the things out, you've got the stamps on the envelopes, whatever, they're all sent out, or you put things in the internal mail if that's what you're using, and out they go. And you can sit back and wait for things to come back in. So that's quite efficient. If you're doing it by face-to-face interviews, and some surveys are done that way, or by telephone interviews, then obviously it's not that efficient. It still takes a lot of time, and someone has to do the interviews and so on. So there's a slight difference. But most surveys are done by some kind of self-response on paper or on the web, so it is quite efficient. As I already mentioned, there are different ways of delivering it, and there's a question about how to do that, really, about how you should decide whether to do it postally or electronically. The important thing about that is it's very efficient, it's easy to do, it's usually easy to get to people because you can send it to them or just email it to them. The downside is that you're not there when they fill in the questionnaire. So any problems they have with it, you can't answer. Anything that you forgot, that's why the piloting is so important, because anything that goes wrong at that stage, you cannot fix it. You are not there. And all they can do is work around the mistakes you've made in your design or the ambiguities you have in your design and deal with that. As a whole, I mean, I've mentioned most of these things already, the web, the email, giving handouts. I mean, if you're seeing a group, like if I were doing a survey of you, I would actually bring along the questionnaire to the class and just hand it to you, like the handouts I've given you earlier on. And then I collect it in perhaps next week, or actually probably ideally collect it in at the end of the session before you disappear, because the chances of you all remembering to bring it back next week are not 100%. So, whereas if you're still here, so you have to think about all those kind of things in designing the survey. How are they going to get it back to you? How are people going to be reminded to get things back to you? And I'll talk a bit more about that response rate issue in the second half. The alternative is in person by interview or by telephone interview. It's very expensive and so on, but it does enable you to be a bit more flexible in the way you're giving the questions and the way you're getting the answers. And if you're unsure about how to design the questions, sometimes it might be a good idea to do it in person. But it's done quite rarely these days because it's just so expensive to do. If you're going to do that, why not do proper depth interviews where you can be a lot more kind of flexible about how you're doing the study. And then there's dealing with non-responses, and I'll come back to that a little bit later when I talk about sampling issues, but there are some tactics you can use to try to improve the response rate. The response rate is essentially the number or the proportion of questionnaires you actually get back that you can work with. So it's the number you get back divided by the number you sent out. And response rates in surveys can vary enormously. A very good survey done in a closed situation amongst people you know and so on. So if I did it on you, for example, and I did it in the class and I collected it at the end, I might expect to get 100% response rate. I might not get it. It might be one or two of you who object to it or write silly things on the questionnaire that means I can't use it. So the response rate is slightly smaller, but it's quite a high response rate. More typically, though, if things are done postally or by the web, response rates drop dramatically. So we're talking here about 30%, 20%, 10% response rates. A good response rate in a postal survey is more like about 50, 60%. So it gives you some idea. If you've done a postal survey and you get 6%, then you can celebrate. It's done really well. So that's why it's an issue. But it can be as low as below 10%, particularly on the World Wide Web. There are other problems actually with measuring response rates on the web, which I'll come back to later. Okay, so imagine you've got past this. You've now got your final date. You have to give a final date on, for things to be sent back to you or collected. And now you've got all the things you're going to work with. What do you do with all these questionnaires? Well, you have to edit and code them. Editing doesn't mean changing them. It means making sure you can make sense of them. If there are ambiguities in the way people have done things, you need to resolve those ambiguities or ignore the question if that's appropriate. And then you have to code them. And coding in this area, in the area of surveys, means translating the answers on a questionnaire, the ticks on the boxes or the things people have written in open-ended questions, translating those into numbers. And it's the numbers you need at the end. That's what you then put into your stats package, or in the old days onto your big spreadsheet, your physical spreadsheet. Spreadsheets originally, of course, were bits of paper with squares and rows and columns on, and that's how you did it. But these days, almost everybody uses a stats package to actually analyse the data. The one we use here is called SPSS. And it's available on all the machines here to use. So you're translating the answers on the questionnaires, the actual sheets you get back, into a set of numbers that you can then input into that stats package. So then you have computer entry and editing. You may need to do some work on that. I've just been involved in a project called Coping. It's a European funded project looking at, what we did actually was we surveyed families where one of the parents was in prison, usually the father, but sometimes the mother, in prison. And we contacted the prisoner, the other parent, or the other carer if it wasn't the partner, and the children. And in fact, we surveyed them and interviewed them as well. We had two stages, a mixed method design in that sense. And on the survey stage, we had to spend an awful lot of work sorting out the ambiguities in the survey. Partly it was because it was done in 4 countries, in 4 different languages, and so we had to have problems of different ways in which people interpreted the instructions. We had some scales we were using and some other questions and so on, and they were interpreted differently, and we had to try and bring those 4 things together to get a unified data set. So a lot of what's called data cleansing or data cleaning had to go on to sort out what these things actually meant. We weren't changing the results, but rather we were interpreting them to make sense against the other numbers, adjusting them. The scales aren't always the same scales, so we had to adjust the scales to make them, to normalise them, to bring them into line with the other groups and things of that kind. So in large-scale surveys, you can get involved in quite a lot of work, and it was very frustrating going through this, particularly for the researchers involved, trying to sort out these kinds of issues. Once the survey was finished, we got all the data back, and then we still had to cleanse it in that kind of way to actually use it. Fortunately, for most things I suspect you'll be involved with, certainly if you're doing a survey on your own, that's much less of an issue. Normally it's a fairly simple procedure of converting the questionnaires into numbers and inputting them. And then, of course, the analysis. Analysis is actually very, very quick, usually. If you know your stats package, and you know what questions you're asking, if you go back to the beginning, to the initial design, you've got the right research questions, it's a matter of, clicking a few buttons on the stats package and out comes the results. Of course, interpreting those results takes a bit more effort. You have to understand what the stats mean and what it's telling you about your research questions and so on. But it actually can be quite a quick procedure. And then, of course, you finally have to write up your results and we hope publish them or make them available to others. Okay, so that's the procedures you go through. And I think you can see that the important ones, I think, here are the sampling issues, which I'll come back to later today, the questionnaire design issues, which I've got another session on, and some of the decisions to be made about field work and about your design on that. Let me dwell a bit more on some of those questions. Should you do it remote? I call it remotely. This is where you send a questionnaire out that somebody else your respondent is filling it in when you're not there, versus some kind of interview. And the interview can be on the telephone, it can be face-to-face. We actually go and visit the person in their home sometimes. Or it can be these days, of course, on the internet using some kind of Skype or some technology like that where you can, again, interview them face-to-face, but electronically face-to-face perhaps. Okay, what are the pros and cons? Well, first of all, the remote, sending stuff out, so that either by the web or by email or by paper, giving it out to people, sending it through the post. The pros, well, very often it's the easiest way or the only way to get hold of them. It's very hard to kind of contact people sometimes to get to face-to-face. So giving out questionnaires in that kind of way may be the best way of doing it. Certainly if you're a company trying to interview your customers and they've just bought something from you online, it's by far the easiest way of getting hold of them to send out something that way. As I already mentioned, it's efficient and it's low cost. Once you've done the design and got a piece of paper, it's relatively cheap to print it, relatively cheap to post it to people, but certainly compared with going in person to talk to them, it's cheap. And of course on the web it's even cheaper. There's almost no cost at all once you've done the design work itself. It's a matter of sending stuff out electronically. So it's low cost. And it's also anonymous. Usually, you can of course ask people's names and details, and sometimes that's done as part of the reward system on a questionnaire. So usually at the end somewhere they say, we'd like to enter you into a competition for a small prize, etc., as a way of rewarding you for the effort you've put into this. In order to do so, you must put in your name and address so that we can contact you if you win. And they normally tell you at that stage that your name won't be used as part of the questionnaire and so on. But of course you needn't do that. You can leave it altogether, in which case certainly the paper form is very anonymous. It's almost impossible to tell where it comes from and who filled it in. So anonymity guaranteed. On the web it's slightly different. If it's a web page, then usually that will be anonymous too. It's quite hard to tell where it comes from, and certainly it's very easy not to give away who you are if you're doing it by filling in a web form. If you're sending out the questionnaire by email as an attachment, it has to be sent back to you, then of course in a sense you know where it comes from because the email address will be there when it's sent back to you, but it doesn't have to be actually attached to the questionnaire itself. So again, you can at least keep that separate, and you can of course reassure people that anonymity will be protected and so on in that situation. Okay, so that's the pros of having a remote one. The cons, the against, and what's against it? Well, first of all, the response rate's an issue. If you're doing things face-to-face, then you get 100% response rate just about. I mean, there might be one or two cases where people withdraw and things like this halfway through the interview. But in general, face-to-face interviews give you very high response rates. Once you've got the person, they'll answer the questions. Doing it in a remote sense, by sending it out and so on, will give you a lower response rate. And I've already said how low those can get. Ambiguity is not detected. Again, that's another big issue. You've got to make absolutely sure that your questionnaire is well designed, because you're not going to be there when the people fill it in. And so any problems, any mistakes, any ambiguities, you can't clear them up because you're not there. And respondents may not treat it seriously. I mean, you're not there to see. If you're doing it face-to-face, you can tell if they're joking. And they're unlikely anyway to do that. They're going to take it more seriously because they're face-to-face with you. But if they're remote, who knows? Now, sometimes you can tell people are kidding. You can actually see from the way they're answering the questions that they're not serious, and you have to throw that data away. But it's not always obvious what's going on, what is making people answer in that kind of way. I mean, they can be kind of just ticking at random, and how will you know that ticking boxes at random is just them not taking it seriously, as opposed to being genuine about their answers? So there's that problem of slight uncertainty about how genuine people are in answering their questions. I think most of the time people actually are pretty good. Most people are generous people, most people want to help, and if they're going to fill it in, they're disposed to help you in your survey. So I think most cases people are doing it genuinely, but you never know. There'll be some who get bored halfway through, and I mean, you do find sometimes when you do these kind of surveys that you get some questionnaires back that are half filled in. The first half filled in, they get halfway to get bored, can't be bothered, that's it, and then just send it back at half done. It's up to you whether you keep that data or not. In some cases you perhaps should throw it all away. In other cases you might keep the half that's been filled in and ignore the others. So that's an issue about serious treatment. What about the other way, doing it face-to-face in some way? I use the term face-to-face to mean either in person, there bodily with the person, or by telephone, or by internet interview, I think something of that kind, remote interview. Now obviously it's the other way around. The pros are that you can clarify the questions, I've said it already, and I think by being there face-to-face, you are encouraging, involvement. You're encouraging them to take things seriously, to think seriously about the questions they're asking, and not just be flippant about how they're answering. And of course, you're encouraging actual response. If you can get hold of them, you can contact the people and get there, you're going to get a response once you've started the interview, almost certainly, compared with the distance approach, the remote approach. The cons, the arguments against this, interviewer bias, and I've already talked about that last week, those kind of possibilities, but interviewers can bias the way that the answers are given and so on. I think I've mentioned it to you so far. There's a classic example, again, this is back in the 1950s, I think, this research was done. In fact, that dates it, yes, it has to be the 50s, because somebody did some research looking, I think the topic of the survey was something to do with marriage and probably sexual relations, something a bit kind of sensitive to ask people about. And the interviewers were all women, and the way it was set up was on half the interviews, they all dressed exactly the same. Each interview they wore the same kind of clothing, dressed the same kind of way, kind of smart, casual kind of clothing. But on half the occasions, they wore a wedding ring on their finger, and half the occasions they didn't wear a wedding ring. So half of them had this, what you might call reasonably subtle symbol that they were married, and half that they weren't married. And what they found, they got on this kind of area of sexual relations and so on they were asking about, they got a significantly different set of results, despite the fact that everything else was the same questions asked, the same survey used, the same questionnaire used, women dressed the same way, operating the same way and so on. The only difference was the wedding ring. But they found a significant difference in the answers between the two groups. So even quite subtle differences in the interviewer can bias the results in that way. So it is an issue. I guess less so if you're doing it remotely, and of course on the telephone it's only the voice that matters, but even that, the way questions are asked and the way people respond and so on can bias things. So it is an issue. I suppose it's the same thing. Interviewer respondent effects is, I guess that's actually probably what the ring is. It's an interviewer respondent effect rather than bias issue. But bias can be a problem as well. And of course, it may not be seen as anonymous. The fact you're face-to-face, you know who it is you're talking to, means that you've had to have more reassurance about anonymity if that's what you're guaranteeing. And of course, because of that, respondents may be less honest. They may not tell the entire truth because they don't want to tell it to your face. And there may be some advantage in a remote, a non-face-to-face questionnaire use. Okay, what kind of designs can you have in a survey? I mean, I think the ones that most of us have experienced tend to be this first case, that what I call the simple survey. The way I like to think of it is the term I've used here in brackets, the snapshot. It's a bit like taking a snapshot of the milieu, the society you're trying to investigate. A bit like getting a camera out and taking a quick shot. Now, the point about that is it's a picture at a certain period in time. At the point you give the questionnaire, that's the picture you get of the state of affairs in that group, in that population. I say it's ad hoc. It can often is ad hoc. It's just we suddenly think we need to know this. Let's do a survey, and that's what's carried out. Of course, you can repeat things. I mean, another typical survey you'll come across is the opinion poll, and they tend to be repeated. So they'll maybe even use the same questions year after year. But certainly at the time of elections, you'll get several of these kinds of polls going on, these kinds of surveys. But they're all kind of simple surveys. They all kind of generally get a population and then just ask the questions of that population. That's it. That's a snapshot. Based, of course, on really good sampling issues, so they can generalise the whole population. A second form, though, is slightly different. It's what's called a panel survey. And in the panel survey, you go with the intention of going back more than once. And to do that, you don't have two ad hoc or simple surveys. You have a panel of people that you go back to. And again, this actually happens during during election times with opinion poll surveys. They'll have a panel of voters who they ask questions of. And the strength of a panel survey is judging change over time. And of course, that's the interest of these opinion pollsters, is in how people's views, political views, are changing over time. The panel is a group of people, a sample, usually done, picked for good statistical reasons as to being representative of the population, but then they're asked back on several occasions. So you go back on 2 or more occasions to ask them the same set of questions, or maybe different questions, but often the same kinds of questions again. And as I said, the real power of this kind of approach is to judge change. In the case of opinion polls, change over a matter of a few weeks, of course. Now that's quite difficult to do, and it's quite difficult to get that panel, to get them to come back with them. I mean, often they're paid to do that, but even then, people don't always come back again. So this third version, the rotating sample survey, is sometimes used. You just repeat the survey with some respondents the same, but others changing. So you can get some comparison with previous occasions. So it's a kind of mixture of 1 and 2. And then number 4, which actually is to some extent a bit like the panel survey, but it's normally much larger scale and much longer in time. Panel surveys tend to operate over a few months. So the issues about keeping people are relatively easy to deal with. You just ask them to come back in a few weeks' time to have another interview or to take part in another survey. Whereas longitudinal surveys are often done over years, if not decades. But longitudinal surveys, in a sense, are the best possible form of survey in getting ideas of things over time. And it has to be said also of making judgments about causality. As things change over time, you get a much better idea of what is causing what. A snapshot, it's quite difficult to make any kind of judgment about causality. You find this is what happens, they do this, they do that, and so on. But answering the question, Why do they do that? Why is that group different from that? Is much harder to do with a snapshot, with a simple survey. With a longitudinal survey over a period of years, you can get some handle on those questions, those why questions. Why is that group different from that, and so on? Usually through some kind of correlation approach. So it's typically a form of panel over a long period of time. The panel is normally kind of chosen at a certain point. I mean, one of the most famous examples of this is the study of children born in a certain year. Of course, I can't remember off the top of my head what the year is now, but I think it was back in the 1960s when they started. And every X years after that, they go back and find the same children, then they become adults and so on. And you can then find things changing over time, health issues, issues of marriage and divorce and things of that kind, job issues, etc., educational things changing over periods of time. So you can make connections, and you can see that the same people are doing these things 10, 20, 30 years later. Now, of course, that's very hard to do. You've got to go back and contact the same people who are moving around the country, and they're dying and getting ill, and they're getting married and changing their names and so on. So they're quite difficult to get hold of. So a lot of effort has to go into keeping in touch, refinding people who've moved away and so on. But it's worth it because you get such good quality data from it. Now, of course, because of the difficulties, often it's governments that do this. So that the money you need to set up this kind of longitudinal study is quite large, and so it's government funding that often does it. And of course, the time period too is an issue. If you're thinking about doing a PhD in this, a 3-year PhD, you really haven't got time to do a longitudinal study. In most cases, it is possible. I mean, I did have one PhD student a few years ago who did a study where she went back to families. She picked some families and looking at families with long-term illness, or one of the members of the family had long-term illness. And she went back on 3 different occasions over a period of a couple of years to see how things had changed as the prognosis developed and as the actual experience of the illness changed and so on. So she gets some idea through that longitudinal study. But it's relatively limited over that time period in a short study period. Okay, so that's some ideas of the different kinds of studies that you can do in a survey.